The story survives because it sounds certain. A city, a war, a trick concealed in wood. For centuries, the image has felt stable, almost immovable. A single object explains an ending that otherwise feels too large to grasp. But certainty is doing most of the work here. When a story lasts this long, it often does so by smoothing over what cannot be known. The Trojan Horse is remembered as an event, yet what reaches us is closer to a decision about what kind of uncertainty we are willing to tolerate. This episode examines one detail that rarely receives attention. Not to solve the mystery, not to confirm or deny the horse, but to ask how a single shift in interpretation changes what the story is actually doing. The Trojan War sits at the edge of history and myth. Late Bronze Age conflicts around the Aegean are real enough. Cities rose and fell, trade routes fractured, violence left traces in ash and stone. But Troy itself exists in layers, archaeological strata, competing dates, walls rebuilt over ruins that were already ruins. The horse enters the story much later, not in the earliest fragments of war memory, but in poetry, in songs meant to be remembered, not verified, in narratives shaped by performance and repetition. What survives is not a report, it is a version. In the most familiar telling, the Greeks cannot breach Troy's defenses, so they leave behind a wooden horse, vast and hollow, a gift, a signal of retreat. The Trojans debate. Warnings are ignored. The horse is pulled inside the walls. At night, soldiers emerge. Gates open, the city falls. The detail most often questioned is scale. Could such an object be built? Could it be moved? Could it be concealed? But that is not the most fragile part of the story. The more destabilizing detail is this. In some early versions, the horse is never clearly an object at all. The Greek word used is hippos, horse. But in the Bronze Age world, that word does not belong only to animals. Ships were called horses of the sea. Siege engines were described with animal terms. Symbols moved easily between categories. Language had not yet hardened into technical boundaries. If the horse is not an object, the story shifts. A ship dragged inland, a siege device misinterpreted, a ritual offering misunderstood, a metaphor later made literal by repetition. None of these explanations resolves the mystery, but each removes the comfort of the object, because the object makes the story manageable. A single thing causes the collapse. A single mistake explains the loss. A single lapse in judgment closes the war. Without the horse as an object, what remains is something less contained. A city already weakened, a population exhausted, internal disagreement. Fear, belief, ritual, and uncertainty entangled. The horse simplifies. It compresses complexity into a shape that can be pictured. This is not unusual. When events become too layered to hold in memory, stories condense them. They assign cause to something visible, something portable, something that can be passed down without footnotes. Over time, the visible cause replaces the underlying conditions. The more the story is retold, the more solid the object becomes. Yet archaeology is silent about the horse. Excavations at Hisarlik reveal destruction layers, burned structures, broken walls, human presence interrupted and resumed. But no trace of a vast wooden structure. No debris that demands such an explanation. This absence does not disprove the story. Wood decays, fire consumes, evidence disappears. But the absence matters because of what fills the gap. In the absence of proof, repetition becomes authority. The horse survives because it fits the shape of the ending we expect. A clever reversal, a moral about deception, a warning about trust. It also flatters the listener. It implies that disasters come from being fooled, not from being worn down. The detail that changes the story is not whether the horse existed. It is whether the Trojans understood what they were doing. In many tellings, they are naive. They ignore warnings. They fail to listen to prophets. They choose celebration over caution. But this reading depends on hindsight. From inside the city, the war had already lasted a generation. Sieges do not end cleanly. They erode routines. They fracture attention. They exhaust vigilance. If the horse was a ship, if it was a ritual object, if it was a misunderstood signal rather than a deception, then the fall of Troy looks less like a mistake and more like a convergence. At some point, uncertainty becomes unbearable. At some point, a population chooses an interpretation that allows the night to end. The horse in this reading is not the cause. It is the moment the story later chooses to blame. Legends often do this. They locate failure in a single decision rather than a long erosion, because erosion is harder to narrate. The earliest audiences of the Trojan stories were not asking historical questions. They were listening for patterns. What happens when belief overrides warning? What happens when signs are misread? What happens when meaning is assigned too quickly? The horse functions as a container for those questions, but containers leak. As scholarship revisits the language, the archaeology, the transmission of the text, the object begins to wobble. And when it wobbles, something else becomes visible. The story may never have been about concealment. It may have been about interpretation. The Trojans do not fail because they are tricked. They fail because they must decide what something means under pressure. That pressure is rarely emphasized. The long siege, the hunger, the internal doubt, the fading certainty that the walls will always hold. In this context, any explanation that promises closure becomes attractive. A gift means the enemy is gone. A ritual means the gods have shifted. A sign means the waiting is over. The horse, literal or not, offers an ending. Stories that endure often offer endings that feel earned. But earned does not mean accurate. It means psychologically satisfying. The more unstable the historical ground, the more stable the symbol becomes. Centuries later, Roman poets retell the story with increasing confidence. The horse grows larger, the warnings grow clearer, the guilt becomes sharper. By then, the story serves a different function. It explains how a civilization fell and how another inherited its legacy. The horse becomes a hinge between worlds, yet hinges are invented after the door has already moved. What is lost in this process is uncertainty. The original listeners may have known that the story was unstable, that it gestured towards something that could not be fully named. But over time, repetition hardens uncertainty into form. The detail that changes the story is the possibility that no one, including the storytellers, knew exactly what happened. And that the story survives, not despite this, but because of it. A literal horse invites debate about mechanics. A symbolic horse invites reflection about belief. Both readings coexist uneasily, but the symbolic reading removes the comfort of distance. If the fall of Troy was not caused by a trick, then it was caused by ordinary human limits, fatigue, interpretation, the need for meaning under strain. That is harder to admire from afar. The Trojan horse endures because it allows us to say, they were fooled. It prevents us from saying, this is how collapses actually happen. Slowly, confusingly, with no single moment that feels decisive until after it is over. When one detail shifts, the story no longer belongs safely to the past. It begins to echo. How often do we look for the object instead of the condition, the moment instead of the pattern, the trick instead of the exhaustion that made the trick persuasive? The mystery is not whether a wooden horse stood before Troy. The mystery is why we need it to have stood there, and what it costs us to believe that collapse always arrives disguised as something obvious. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Trojans were not blind. They may have seen clearly enough. They may have argued. They may have hesitated. And still, the city fell. Because uncertainty does not resolve itself just because it is recognized. At some point, every community chooses a story that allows it to move forward, even if that story is incomplete. The horse may be that story, not a structure of wood, but a structure of meaning. If so, then the detail that changes everything is not hidden inside the horse. It is hidden inside us. What do we accept as explanation when waiting becomes unbearable? And how often do we mistake a story that ends uncertainty for a story that tells the truth? The Trojan horse may never be found, but its shape remains visible wherever history is simplified into objects we can point to. And perhaps that is the real inheritance of Troy. Not a cautionary tale about deception, but a reminder that uncertainty, once sealed inside a story, rarely stays contained. It waits, and it repeats. For more reflections on history, power, and human nature, subscribe to Timeless Questions.